Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to look at James Joyce's writing on James Clarence Mangan, a famous Irish poet, which he wrote in 1907 at the age of 25 and can be found in his occasional critical and political writings. This is a really interesting piece to look at because, considering my interest in Finnegans Wake, I was trying to peruse some of his earlier, more formal writings in order to figure out his aesthetics and some of his political leanings and stuff like that. And I was struck by the way in which his writings here on Mangan herald the character of HCE, which we find in Finnegans Wake. And I want to go through this writing to look at the way that he sort of uses Mangan as an emblem for the kind of person that he wants to be as James Joyce, but also the struggles that we see in the character of HCE as outcast, as sinner, as victim of the public, and always an other of sorts, but also the way that we see Finnegans Wake being written. And I think that this is helpful because Finnegans Wake is, of course, written in a rather perplexing manner, whereas this is a lot more straightforward, so it can kind of help to see Joyce's thought put in more plain prose. He writes that there are certain poets who, in addition to their virtue of revealing aspects of the human consciousness to us that were unknown until their age, also possess the more questionable virtue of embodying in themselves the thousand conflicting tendencies of their age, of turning themselves into, so to speak, storage batteries of a new energy. And this is indeed what Finnegans Wake in general is about, but the character of HCE specifically, that he is a storage battery for latent tendencies expressing the historical contingencies of Ireland and of the world in general, expressing the buildup and serving as an emblem for a time. And Joyce laments the tendency to turn poets like this into statues, who he says, because it honors the dead while flattering the living, and has the further supreme advantage of finality, since to the truth it is the most efficient and courteous way yet discovered of ensuring a lasting oblivion of the deceased. We turn old forms of history and we turn ideals into statues, and by doing so we honor ourselves and we flatter ourselves, but to our detriment, where we become stultified in our current state, which was a real questionable category of Ireland at the time that made him really question Irish culture in general. And we can see this ruminated on, for example, in Ulysses, where Bloom is worried that he's going to run into Buck Mulligan, so he goes into a museum and he starts looking at these statues of various women and starts thinking about the way these stultified statues relate to the ideal notion of beauty versus the real fleshy beauty of his wife Molly, who's waiting for him at home but potentially engaged in an actively ongoing affair. And in this moment, Bloom is thinking about the ways that the ideals are stultified in architecture and in statues of this sort, and he kind of makes fun of this by looking at the backside of these statues to see if the sculptors thought it wise to put an asshole on the statue, which is an interesting sort of turnaround that we see made much more explicit in Finnegans Wake. But even here we can see that the oblivion of the deceased that we see reified in statues prevents us from actively considering these past historical figures, such as Mangan, as ways to embody and confront the present. He says, but in Ireland, a country destined by God to be the eternal caricature of the serious world, the statue, even when it represents a highly popular man whose character was most amenable to the will of the common people, very rarely advances beyond the laying of the foundation stone. And this foundation stone is where Finnegans Wake finds itself, with a bunch of wandering minstrels and symbolic songs, as he puts it, which need a sort of ordering logic, but in fact find themselves in disrepute. And he speaks of Mangan that, like Parnell, he sinned against that incorruptible chastity that Ireland would demand of any John who would baptize her, or of any Joan who would liberate her, as being the first essential and divine test of their worthiness of such lofty offices. In other words, the very condition of success demands that success's eventual fall. And indeed, this is the paradox of Finnegans Wake, that the legitimation of authority, the viability of transcendence, simultaneously evokes its opposite. And thus, the dueling brothers of Shem and Sean represent the battle of Set and Horus in the Egyptian pantheon, and various other dualisms such as Cain and Abel, which represent the inability for anyone to transcend their historical moment particularly. And he speaks of the appearance of one such genius is always the signal for all corrupt invested interests to rally behind the defense of the old order, the cult of respectability, as he puts it. That the invocation of the new, to bring back this binary, always brings with it the invocation of its opposite in order to try to acquiesce to the stultifying standards of the time. And save for this small remembrance, Joyce continues, Mangan has been a stranger in his country, a rare and bizarre figure in the streets, where he is seen dejectedly going forward like one who does penance for some ancient sin. Surely life, which Novalis has called a malady of the spirit, is a heavy penance for Mangan, one who has perhaps forgotten the sin that laid it upon him. An inheritance all the more sorrowful because of that fine artist in him which reads so truly the lines of brutality and of weakness in the faces of men who look upon him with contempt and hatred. This is the backside of the cult of respectability that HCE finds himself in the face of in Finnegans Wake. That there is a contempt and hatred that goes along with the legitimating mechanisms of society, of being respectable, of being successful, of being noteworthy. And in so doing, the conditions of remembrance are the historical baggage of an unknown sin of one's forefathers that one carries with one, which can be seen as history itself, a virtual dream, as he puts it, that follows one, which indeed, that's kind of what haunts Finnegans Wake the whole time, is it's constantly concerned with resurrection and redemption. Redemption in the sense of literally being redeemed, as in being deemed the property of the transcendent, of the absolute, of returning to some lost point, which is simultaneously a historical previousness, an antiquity, and simultaneously a divine future. And in so doing, one whose nature is so sensitive cannot forget his dreams in a secure, strenuous life, James Joyce says. And this struggle with memory, with the sin of memory and history itself, prompts the forward motion of Finnegans Wake. Speaking of Mangan, Joyce says that the learning of many lands goes with him always, Eastern tales in the memory of curiously printed medieval books which have wrapped him out of his time, gathered together day by day and embroidered as in a web. He has acquaintance with a score of languages which, upon occasion, he makes a liberal parade, and has read in many literatures, crossing how many seas. This is the polyvocality that Joyce really finds so alluring in Finnegans Wake. This embroidering of a web which comes together to both betray a structure in the sense of evoking it, but also betraying as in when one betrays a friend to an enemy, forsakes one. There is this real duality present of the necessity of structure and polyvocality, but also the very encroaching chaos that is the very condition of the difference of polyvocality. He says that oftentimes one finds in Mangan's writing various attributes such as no order whatsoever, insipid efforts, that it is contorted, crude, trivial items, that he wrote with no native literary tradition. This is indeed the hope of Finnegans Wake, the real chaotic side of Finnegans Wake that resists the fetters of history and of the nation. And I've always been struck in Finnegans Wake with the inability to say anything definite about it, because the very notion of definition means precluding the possibility of the recognition of the other. This is a standard Hegelian point that is continued on in post-structuralist theory, and therefore Joyce is constantly obsessed with the reconciliation of opposites that cannot come to an end, the very condition of movement that requires poles between which movement can occur. It reminds me of Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, speaking of man as a bridge and not a goal. That the very act of movement itself is the means by which we express and continue ourselves, and that the very condition of life is this inability to find a true reconciliation of opposites in the Hegelian sense. This is why I think Joyce is very markedly anti-Hegelian insofar as he does not conceive of the dialectic as necessitating synthesis, as if the dialectic progressed via genuinely absolute negation. It is only relative negation which Nietzsche recognizes as a form of production. This is how Deleuze sees it as well. Thus, the reconciliation of opposites is oftentimes trying to encompass an increasingly larger scope, and in so doing producing some form of movement. Thus, Joyce writes, East and West meet in that personality, we know how. Images interweave there like soft, luminous scarves, and words ring like brilliant mail. And whether the song is of Ireland or of Istanbul, it has the same refrain, a prayer that peace may come again to her who has lost her peace, the moon-white pearl of his soul. Amen. And I think this is really interesting because it reminds me of the closing of Finnegans Wake, and maybe even the closing of the first chapter of Finnegans Wake, around page 28 or 29, where you see this coming back. We have some feminine figure here, the moon-white pearl of his soul, with the pronoun her here, but of course the her is ambiguous, always fleeting, and liminal, as is the case for Joyce's work, in which the reconciliation of opposites is undergirded by a force of chaos and disrepute and refuse, which is the very condition of change itself. This is a very great description of Finnegans Wake. A world filled with melodies, lights, and perfumes. The world that inevitably develops around and lends context to every face which a poet's eyes have looked upon with love. It is a single chivalrous idea, a single masculine devotion. And this very notion of a masculine devotion brings to mind the archetypal character of HCE, who is in many ways all of the great historical persons, the Weltgeschichte Person, as Hegel puts it, the world historical persons, but also every man, right? HCE is here comes everybody, haveth childers everywhere. And this everywhere is the presence of sonorosity, of visuality, of touch, of smell, all of the senses congealed in this embroidered web, pushed forward by some masculine force of vitality, which is HCE. But as Deleuze and Guattari put much later in the beginning of their Anti-Oedipus, it fits and starts, it shits and fucks, it starts and stops in a constant motion of change and differentiation. Continuing, he says, it is a savage world, a world of eastern nights. The mental activity brought about by the opium has strewn this world with marvelous and horrible images. The whole Orient recreated by the poet in his fevered dreams, which are the paradise of the opium eater, pulsates through these pages in phrases and similes against apocalyptic landscapes. I mean, this is Finnegans Wake, right? We're seeing the heralding and the sort of brewing of the artistic aesthetic image, which is going to come to the fore in Finnegans Wake, in which we have a sort of surrealist aesthetic combined with a liberatory tone, the likes of which we would see in Nietzsche, for example, or Rilke, or even later Henry Miller in the American tradition. He says of Mangan, under a veil of mysticism, he sings of the fallen glory of his country, resemble a mist covering the horizon on a summer's day. fine, impalpable, about to melt away, but suffused with small points of light. Sometimes the music seems to awake from its languor and cry out in an ecstasy of battle, and that it speaks of the desperate energy of his race. This indeed reminds one of the very ending of Portrait of the Artist, in which he speaks of forging in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of one's race, right? That the future is all about it being partial in the sense of being both biased and incomplete. And the bias, of course, is the fetters of the future, the fact that one doesn't just make it up whole cloth, but it depends upon the fetters of the existing conditions of the present. But it also has the fragmentary, uncreated nature that is the very condition of creativity itself. I think this really sums up Joyce's project as a whole. He speaks of the spirit of revenge that has attained such heights of melody, reminding us of the sonorous nature of Joyce's writing. You can really see this in James Joyce or in Finnegans Wake, with this privileging of the materiality and the pronunciation of speech over its semantic content. The heroic note occasionally becomes hoarse, and a troop of unmannerly passions echoes it derisively. This is the chaos that is always pressing upon us in Finnegans Wake. The heroic note of the warlord, who is often caricatured as the Duke of Wellington, as Sir Tristram, as Mohammed, all of these various warlord figures who represent the very condition of order, but also through the bringing in of disorder as a sort of a liminal byway to get from the means to the end. He says that Mangan is one who subsumes into himself the spirit of an age and country, aims to create not for some dilettante's entertainment, but to convey in rough blows the animating idea of his life to his followers. This animating idea reminds me of the élan vital that Bergson speaks of, that is so central to this vitalist conception shared by Joyce and by various other people I'm interested in, like Artaud, Deleuze-Guattari, Foucault, and more. He says that Mangan, and I think this is important for considering Joyce's self-perception of himself, refused to prostitute himself to the rabble or become a mouthpiece for politicians. He was one of those strange, aberrant spirits who believed that the artistic life should be nothing other than the continuous and true revelation of the spiritual life, who believed that the inner life is of such worth as not to depend on any particular support, and so abstain from offering confessions of faith. This is what Finnegans Wake does. We never get a concrete faith. It is a spiritual text, markedly so, an ecologically spiritual text, in a sense, constantly preaching of the earth, as Nietzsche would put it, and yet the terms of this faith, the propositions that it utters, are never clear. One who believes, finally, that the poet is sufficient unto himself, inheritor and preserver of a secular heritage, and has therefore no need to be strident, preachifying, or cloyingly sweet. We don't need to sugarcoat things, in other words. For Joyce, I think there's something very empathetic about the directness of his speech. And I think this directness, of course, when taken into the mind of a dreamer in Finnegans Wake, of course, hinges on madness or insanity. He says that all of Mangan's poetry remembers wrongs and suffering and the aspiration of one who was moved to great cries and gestures when he sees again in his thoughts the hour of his sorrow. This is the theme of much of Irish poetry, but no other Irish song is as full as those of Mangan, of nobly suffered misfortunes and such irreparable devastations of the soul. He speaks of the deep sense of sorrow and bitterness, and of the faith of the solitary, which is the very condition of Mangan's poetry. And I think we see this so strongly voiced by Joyce, that there's a profound sense of being dealt a bad hand, but also somehow being complicit in, for example, nativism and racism that Joyce saw in the Ireland of his time. That it was not enough to simply become a nationalist and pit oneself against the British, but realize Irish culture's complicity in the barbarousness that the English convicted them of. He says, it speaks, that being poetry, of what seems fantastic and unreal to those who have lost the simple intuitions which are the tests of reality. Poetry takes little account of many of the idols of the marketplace, the succession of the ages, the spirit of the age, the mission of race. The essential effort of the poet is to liberate himself from the unpropitious influences of such idols which corrupt him from the inside and out. And there's a paradox here, which is, of course, that this itself is a very biased appraisal of what it means to be an artist, because it imagines a hyper-liberatory state of artistic freedom, which at the same time neglects the fact that one is thrown into a culture that one cannot just throw off whole cloth without ceasing to be the person, the very stylistic emblem which the artist is. Therefore, there's this constant dueling notion of being accountable to one's history and nation, and also needing to subvert it at its very core. Therefore, Joyce continues that Mangan also inherits the latest and worst part of a tradition upon which no divine hand has drawn out the line of demarcation. We don't have the rules set in advance. A tradition which dissolves and divides against itself as it moves down the cycles. I think this notion of cyclical progression feels very Wakean to me. And because this tradition has become an obsession for him, he has accepted it with all its failures and regrets, which he would bequeath just as it is. The poet who hurls his anger against tyrants would establish upon the future an intimate and far more cruel tyranny. And he says that in that miserable, reedy, and feeble figure, a hysteric nationalism receives its final justification, and in so doing also finds the very conditions of its oblivion. This is the real dualism that Joyce finds himself in the midst of as an Irish expatriate. That he wants to understand himself as an Irishman, but an Irishman, the terms of whom's Irishness is yet to be established. That is the liminal and coalitional sense of identity that you can actually find, funnily enough, in the work of the gender politics of Judith Butler. That if we want to have a feminist politics, if we build it upon a coherent, stable, universal notion of feminism, of what it means to be feminine or woman, we preclude feminism's ability to be representative because it always precludes the representation of someone who may be on the margins and may be considered in or outside our legitimating categories. Therefore, to put identity in strict terms is to preclude its liberatory capacities in the beginning. And therefore, Joyce is finding himself in this hopefully somewhat more clear writing, faced at the interstices of this incredibly difficult project in a way that I think heralds a lot of the topic matter of Finnegans Wake. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helped make sense of Joyce's project. You can check out any of my other lectures on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which I do once per month. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate one time to the channel, because it helps me out and helps me purchase books, which are oftentimes more expensive than one would imagine, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.